righty, it looks like it is about that time. So we will go ahead and get ready, get rolling. Give Wanda time to get her. Oh, all right, we'll get started. Prayer list this morning. Carla says Terry is continuing to recover from his surgery. Anybody with any updates on Lisa Bridges? Anybody, anything there other than what's in the bulletin? So she's had surgery and is at home. Wayne Finn, any updates there? Everybody quiet this morning. Everybody all quiet. Anybody not in the bulletin? I assume Mary Lynn is continuing to recover. And then anybody not in the bulletin that we're not aware of that's not in there this morning? Shirley Oates, okay. We had Dad down yesterday and took him to lunch, had a family lunch, and then he wanted to go to I hate to say the way he said it, but he said he wanted to go to the farm one more time, so we took him out to the farm on Maple Grove Road, and he got to see how it lays out between me, my brother, and my sister. And so he got a chance to go out there and show some friends and family members where he grew up, where the house was when he was born. But if you'll keep Dad's now 91. He is having some memory issues, and he's just, some days I call him and talk to him and he's tired. So, but if anybody else we need to remember, of course, the Clarksville school community, especially the folks at Kenwood after the bus crash last week where the 2 students were killed. And I know that there's still several recovering from that. So, anything else? If not, Mr. Pete, would you get us started this morning? All right, thank you, sir. All right, we're going to continue on. We may get some overlap today because I haven't talked to Freddie and know what he did, what he got done last week. So I'm going to pick up where I left off, and if we get some overlap, we get some overlap. But we're going to start with Hebrews chapter 11 today. So if you want to go ahead and get your digital device or your paper Bible set to Hebrews chapter 11. And here we're going to see that the author highlights individuals who, despite difficulty, continued to believe and serve God faithfully. Now again, as we've covered this whole letter, looked at this whole letter, the writer started out addressing an audience who was drifting back into the things of the old way. And he has gone through the process of saying how Jesus was superior to angels, how Jesus was superior to Moses, how all the superior aspects of Jesus. And he's also now gone through, as we looked at a couple of weeks ago, some warnings and some encouragement for those he's addressing. And now he's going to point out some of the great examples of faith to an audience who would recognize these names that he's pointing out, and he's going to point out how their faith played into the relationship with God. So he's going to highlight individuals who, despite difficulty, believed God and served God faithfully. And he does this in order to show them two things. He does it to show them two things. One, that faith has always been the key response that God has desired from his people. Not perfection, not ceremony, or eloquence. You know, there's scripture that tells us it's not the sacrifice that God has ever wanted, it is our faithfulness that he has wanted all along. Us to be faithful to him. Also, that his readers are recipients of the blessings that all their predecessors were faithfully waiting for. He's going to look at a lot of these people from the Old Testament and say, they stayed faithful even though they did not get to see the promise come to fruition. But they stayed faithful all the way until they passed away. And they died in faith, still waiting for the promise to arrive. So faith in the Old Testament times was seen as confidence in God, perseverance, and a vision of the unseen. Now, in some aspects, that's still true for us today, isn't it? It's still waiting for a promise. The ultimate faith and the ultimate promise is what comes on the other side. And we're still waiting faithfully, hopefully, to attain that promise. Sincere faith in the Christian era is clearly seen as the believer striving to obey Jesus' teachings and follow him, trusting in him and his promises. It's still a matter of faith for us today. The author says that faith is primarily two things. One, faith is assurance. The original Greek word translated into the English word assurance referred to the substructure or foundation of a building. Now, faith is our foundation, is it not? Whatever we have in our walk, faith is the foundation. Is there anything to it if we don't have faith? Is there anything to it if we have no faith? If we don't have faith, does it matter? Faith is the foundation on which everything is then built. What happens if you don't have a good solid foundation? For those in here who are involved in building and things, what happens if you don't have a good foundation? Falls apart. Has problems, has structure issues. It's not strong. It can't stand it when the wind comes. If you don't have a good foundation, when trials and other difficulties come, it comes crumbling down around you. It's one of the things, it's amazing to me. I've seen the two new gymnasiums, storm shelters they built in Hopkins County. It's amazing to what kind of structure we can build these days. Those tornado shelters, the auxiliary gyms at both Madisonville North and Hopkins Central, have a sign on them. Those buildings are built to stand 250-mile-an-hour winds for 3 minutes. Think about that, 250-mile-an-hour winds. Is our foundation and our faith strong enough to sustain 250-mile-an-hour winds for 3 minutes? Or for longer? Also, faith is made up of conviction. The original Greek word translated into the English word conviction was a legal term referring to evidence upon which a case was built. faith is your foundation. Conviction is you have enough evidence to say, this is why I have faith. How strong is your conviction? How strong is your conviction today? And what basis? What was the evidence for you? At what point in your walk when you became a Christian? What was the conviction that got you to the point and said, yes, this is it? Or did you just grow up and you grew up in conviction? But what is enough evidence for you to convict you that what God says is true, that there is a God and that He sent His Son and that His Son died for you? And through your faith in His Son, you attain the promise. Where is your conviction? Where does it come from? What faith was in the Old Testament is now fully realized in the New Testament through Jesus. What faith was in the Old Testament is now fully realized in the Old Testament. Faith serves as a basis from which people gain the ability to stake their lives on unseen realities. Unseen realities. Our faith is on what is unseen. We take things we can see and build our faith maybe on it, but ultimately our faith is on things unseen. I mean, if you look there at verses 1, 2, and 3. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. For by this our ancestors were approved. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so what is seen was made from things that are not visible. Faith is the foundation that permits hope. From the standpoint of our faith, if we don't have faith, do we have any hope? I think today, a lot of times, we need hope more than ever. But faith is the foundation that permits hope. In the beginning there of chapter 11, the writer reaffirms the point that faith has always been the basis by which God approves of men, whether they have faith or not. If they had faith, God approved. If not, God did not approve. We said as verses 1 and 2 there, now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen, for by this our ancestors were approved. They were approved of God when they acted in faith. He points out that faith has always been the basis by which God approves of men, whether they have faith or not. And then in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. The author says that we can only grasp the fact of creation by faith, since it cannot be proven by scientific evidence or observation. We can deduce, but there are no witnesses. Was anybody around other than the Godhead when everything was created? Can anybody testify that they were there on day one and said, yeah, I saw God do this. I saw it happen. No. But we can look around us. There are enough things to deduce. But at some point, we have to have what? Faith. We can look around us and there's a lot of evidence that everything was created. But at some point, we can't prove it to the 100th percentile. We have to have faith that what God's Word said and what God said is how it actually happened. We have to take that step of faith. One writer said, however, if we believe God's Word on the matter, the reason, nature, and purpose for creation becomes clear to us. Think about this. If you did not believe in a created universe, why does everything exist? Big accident. If we do not have faith in the creation, we're just all here by accident. Also, hey, I might as well go out and steal and do whatever I want to do because, hey, I'm just going to wilt away at the end. I might as well enjoy my time here. There really is no reason to have rules. It should be the strongest survives. The strongest gets what they want if there is no evidence of a creator. But there is. And when we see that and we have that faith and we take that step, everything becomes a whole lot more clear that we're not just a cosmic accident. That it didn't just accidentally, things came together in the right mode and kaboom, everything happens. Now, I am sure there was a big bang because when God spoke everything into being, it probably didn't happen quietly. But the big bang is not the way those people said, but it's everything, I'm sure God made it happen dramatically. The people that talk about the big bang and how things just exploded can never explain to you, okay, if all this stuff was out here and it exploded one day and it started creating this, the stuff that was there that exploded initially, where did it come from? Where did all the gases and stuff that were out there in the universe that suddenly one day exploded, how did they get there? And another thing they can't explain when they talk about that is, where else do you see in science an explosion that makes things come together? What do explosions normally do? Blow things up. They don't make things come together. So, when we have the faith on the matter of creation, it becomes clearer to us. The author goes on here in Hebrews to give examples of people who were spoken well of by God on account of their faith. He sets the framework here in verses 1, 2, 3, and then he starts going into a list of people who were spoken well of by God on account of their faith. Now, as we go down through this list here in Hebrews chapter 11, are these perfect people? Were any of these people just wonderfully perfect? Even one that we spend a lot of time here in this chapter looking at questioned God's process, didn't he? At some point, Abraham got a little impatient. Being faithful does not necessarily always mean being perfect. All right, let's go in and let's look at the book here, and we'll start with verse 4, and we will go down through, let's go down through verse 30 right now. It's a long stretch. Verse 4 through verse 30 says, by faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was approved as a righteous man because God approved his gifts, and even though he is dead, he still speaks through his faith. By faith Enoch was taken away, so he did not experience death. He was not to be found because God took him away. For before he was taken away, he was approved of as one who pleased God. Now without faith it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, after he was warned about what was not yet seen and motivated by godly fear, built an ark to deliver his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead, came offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and as innumerable as the grains of sand along the seashore. These all died in faith, although they had not received the things that were promised, but they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. Now those who say such things make it clear that they were seeking a homeland. If they were thinking about where they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, "Your offspring will be traced through Isaac." He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead, therefore he received him back, figuratively speaking. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and he worshiped leaning on top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, as he was nearing the end of his life, mentioned the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions concerning his bones. By faith, Moses, after he was born, was hidden by his parents for 3 months because they saw that the child was beautiful and they didn't fear the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger, for Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. By faith, he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. By faith, they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after being marched around by the Israelites for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute welcomed the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. Think he's trying to make a point? He hits one word a little bit over and over and over and over and over. How important is he trying to stress that faith is here? I love that series. By faith, Moses did this. By faith, they did this. By faith, they did this. If there's one thing that we can take from chapter 11 here, faith is critical. By faith. Let's look, Cain and Abel. Abel's sacrifice was acceptable because it was offered in faith, and consequently he was considered righteous by God. That's one of those stories I still wish we knew a little bit more about. What was it that how was it that Cain did it, that it wasn't acceptable? We just know that Abel's was. Cain's wasn't. Cain got mad and killed his brother. One of the writer's points is that examples of faith are powerful witnesses that can extend beyond our lifetimes. How many of you can look back in your past and see someone that you looked at and thought, they have really great faith that you remember and maybe still are influenced by today? How many of you? If you'll think a minute, think back. Someone, maybe it was a relative, maybe it was someone at the church, maybe it was someone at work who you looked at and thought, they have it. Growing up through the years, I can think back of numerous people and places. I grew up in a bunch of different places, but in each town that I grew up in, spent time in, I can think back to people who lived by faith. From hearing my grandmother singing hymns while she was cooking breakfast in the morning. One of the great memories I've got is laying in the bed at my grandmother's house in Owensboro, and I could hear her in the kitchen cooking breakfast and singing. There have been people I've been a pleasure and been appointed to meet in my life who I can look back on and say, I would not have been the same person if I had not encountered these people. All of us have someone who would be a great witness by how they lived their life. They weren't perfect people, but they knew where to turn when they weren't perfect. What about Enoch? Enoch, it's not the mysterious way that he went to heaven, but the fact that his faith was what? pleasing to God. Can you imagine being so faithful that God says, here, you're not going to have to die. Let's just go. I can't imagine living that well. I would like to get the chance to talk to Enoch and say, why, how did you do it? But he lived in such a way that God said, hey, from earliest history to show that faith was always what God looked for in men. Faith was always what he wanted. Hebrews 11:6 says, now without faith it is what? Impossible to please God. You can't please God unless you have faith in God. You might be able to do a lot of good things and a lot of right things in your life, but if you don't have faith, you don't please Him. Not only does faith please God, it is impossible to please Him without it. Let's let that one sit in and stew a minute. Not only does faith please God, it is impossible to please Him without it. What about Noah? Can you imagine the conversation? We get a little bit of it in text, but can you imagine the conversation? God tells Noah, yeah, I'm going to make it rain. Noah says, Lord, what's rain? Because to this point, had it ever rained? The earth was what? Watered by a mist. So, yeah, we're going to open up. Water's going to come from the ground and it's going to come from the sky. And I'm sure Noah's going, okay, well, whatever you say, Lord, I'm going to build that boat. But Noah believed God at His word about an unseen, and to him at the time it was a highly unlikely event. But in faith, he said, God said it, I'm going to build it. And you can imagine we're not told about all the conversations that people walking by Noah and his sons building the ark had, but you can sure say, now Noah, why are you doing this? Oh, what's rain? We've never had enough water to float that boat. What are you going to do with that? He built it in faith. Noah preached to others for over a century, but they disbelieved, and because of their disbelief, were lost when the flood eventually came. Have you ever wondered in the flood at what point people began to say, maybe Noah was right? At what point do they realize this is not stopping? Maybe we need to run over and see if Noah can let us on that boat. At what point did they suddenly have a little faith when they disbelieved for 100 years? And then Abraham. Abraham was called to move to an unknown land which God said would eventually be his. How many of us would do that today? God says, all right, you're going to have to leave Hopkinsville. You're going down to this far-off place down at the tip of South America. Now, what you're going to do when you got there, we don't know. We're going to get you there first. Because that's essentially what Abraham did. He told Abraham, go. Abraham didn't say, well, okay, I got to pack this. We're going to get to how far this day? Abraham went in faith. He wandered over it as a nomad all of his life, never owning any part except the place where he buried his wife. God says, I'm taking you to a land. And Abraham didn't act like our kids act when we load up and go on vacation. How many of you got kids saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? You have to wonder if Abraham ever thought about turning to the Lord and say, hey, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Abraham was promised many descendants, but his wife only bore him a single son long after childbearing years. God said, you're going to be the father of many. I'm sure Abraham's sitting there going, this ain't happening real quick. Sarah did what at one point when she heard the conversation that Abraham was having? She laughed. And then she has the gall to say what? I didn't laugh. And yes, she did. But Abraham was promised many descendants, and he was getting older and older. He ain't got one yet. But he was promised many. Despite evidence to the contrary, Abraham, never wavered in his belief that God would make good on his promise. He did have a moment of weakness, didn't he? Had a moment of weakness, and maybe he believed, maybe it's going to have to go through Hagar. But he had been promised many descendants, and he has a moment of weakness. So what about the situation with Ishmael? He's promised many descendants, promises Sarah is going to bear him a child, and suddenly, we're at the point here, still getting older. Turn to Genesis 16 a minute. Turn over to Genesis 16 with me a minute. Genesis 16, verses 1 through 6, and it reads, Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family. And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. Then Sarai said to Abram, you're responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you. Abram replied to Sarai, here, your slave is in your power. Do whatever you want with her. Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. Now, we talk about Abraham being a man of great faith. He doesn't come off real presentable in this little stretch, does he? Neither does Sarai at this point. Sarai says, here, have Hagar. We'll get a child that way. Hagar gets pregnant, and Sarai says, wait a minute. And she treats her so bad that Hagar leaves. And she goes to Abraham and says, look, you did this. Abraham says, she's yours. Do whatever you want with her. That's what I was talking about earlier. Just people of great faith are not necessarily perfect people. Still, Abraham was a man of great faith. Most theologians view Abraham's decision to father Ishmael with Hagar as a definitive moment of lapsed faith or spiritual impatience. God's not working on my timetable. We're going to make this happen quicker. Now, bring this forward to us today. What happens to us when we get spiritually impatient? Same sort of thing that happened to Abram, doesn't it? Does God's timetable always operate on our timetable? And that's what we see happening here. Abraham's looking at the clock ticking. He's seeing Sarah getting older day by day by day. And he's thinking, maybe I need to help God. Think about that. Maybe I need to help God. Does God need us to help him make things happen? No. Sometimes faith involves spiritual patience. Sometimes we have to believe that it's going to happen. It may not happen the way we want or how we want, but if we have faith. If we have faith. Theologians often describe the move as Abraham and Sarah as trying to help God out. John Calvin argued that Abraham's sin wasn't just a moral failure, but a failure of the eyes of faith. He stopped looking at the promise and started looking at the quote-unquote biological clock, thinking, if we get too far down the road, God's going to have trouble making this happen. He swapped God's timing for human logic. Anything ever go well when we do that? Who else is a great example of taking their eyes off where they should be? It's a great parallel to Peter stepping out of the boat, isn't it? Peter stepped out of the boat. He walked on water in faith until he did what? Until he took his eyes off of Jesus. He was walking on the water until he got caught up in what was going on around him and took his eyes off the prize. And then we read through verses 13 through 16. Here the author notes that all of these great examples died in faith without receiving the promise. However, they confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They made it clear that they were seeking a country of their own. We're just passers through, aren't we? They recognized that and held out in faith for the promise. These people saw by faith the things that were promised, but died before they actually had them in hand. But they still had faith. Because they saw these through faith, they were willing to bear the difficulties brought about by their vision and never considered turning back. Again, remember, the Hebrews writer here is writing to people that are looking at going back on what they had accepted in Jesus. They were looking back at going to the old ways. And so here he's trying to say, you don't go back. You keep your eyes forward on the prize. By faith, you keep going toward the prize. Because of the faith of those people that they're listing here, God was not ashamed to be associated with them. Sometimes does God get ashamed to be associated with us? When we lose track and when we fail at faith and we lose our faith, that we become where God's ashamed to look at us and say he's associated with us. Turning back to the old ways would be a loss of faith, which would cause them to be rejected by God. He says, look, you've seen it. Jesus is a fulfillment of what the promise was for all of those in the Old Testament. You had that faith. Don't turn your back on it. You be rejected. And then we went through verses 17 through 19 talking about Abraham's faith. It was such that he obeyed God even beyond understanding. He was in the process, think about this, in the process of offering up his only son, whom God said his descendants would eventually come through. This story just, oftentimes you have to sit and think about it. God told Abraham, sacrifice Isaac. How many of us would be willing to sacrifice our children? Even if we had 10, how many of us are going to say, I can sacrifice one, it'll leave me with 9? Clayton, you guys are fairly new parents. Could you even consider that? Could you even consider that? Now, as they get to be teenagers, it becomes a little bit, but nevertheless, we wouldn't consider it. And Abraham's ready to do it. His only son. But it parallels something else. God gave up his only son. The parallels are so specific, the theologians argue the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, is the most complete picture of the sacrifice of Jesus in the entire Old Testament. God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love, in Genesis 22:2. This is the first time the word love is used in the Bible. This mirrors John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. Theologians point out that Isaac wasn't Abraham's only son, he had Ishmael, but he was the unique son of the promise, just as Jesus is the unique Son of God. From the moment God gave the command until the moment he stayed Abraham's hand, 3 days passed. 3 days passed. In Abraham's mind, his son was already dead. Abraham's going through the process, isn't he? He's getting everything ready. He's getting this all ready to go make the sacrifice. In Abraham's mind, Isaac's already gone. Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days. Hebrews 11:17-19 explicitly makes this connection, stating that Abraham received Isaac back from the dead, figuratively speaking. Genesis 22:6 says Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it upon his son Isaac. Isaac carried the very instrument of his own sacrifice up the mountain. Jesus carried his own wooden cross. Theologians highlight the submission of Isaac As a young man, he could have easily overpowered his elderly father, but he chose to submit. Think about this. If Isaac was not going to go along and he suspected something, could he have knocked Abraham in the head and gone? But he goes. He even says to his father, what are we going to sacrifice? And what does Abraham tell him? God will provide. And that Jesus follows the same act of submission. Origen, 3rd century theologian, said he was one of the first to emphasize that Isaac carried the wood just as Christ carried the cross. He argued that Isaac represented Christ's humanity, which suffered, while the ram represented Christ's divinity, the sacrifice provided by God. Soren Kierkegaard wrote, "In Fear and Trembling," he explored the psychological and ethical weight of Abraham's faith. He argued that Abraham is the father of faith because he trusted in God's character even when the command seemed to contradict the promise. What had he been promised by God? That he would be the father of what? Many. Yet God is telling him here what? Kill Isaac. Father of many, but yet the one who that's going to go, oh, wait, this doesn't work out. Math doesn't happen here. But you believe here that Abraham's faith was so strong that not only would either God stop the sacrifice, that God would do what? Abraham had enough faith in God that he believed that even if he proceeded and went through with the sacrifice, that God could raise Isaac again. God had promised him that he would be the father of many. Abraham's faith was so strong that Abraham believed that if I kill him, God's going to bring him back. That is faith. Abraham was not perfect because he had tried to help out God, but now that he's got his only son through Sarah, his faith is strong enough that he's willing to go ahead. One writer said Abraham believed not that God would prevent him from sacrificing Isaac, that he could and would resurrect Isaac if necessary to fulfill the promise. Do we have that kind of faith? We're not being asked to sacrifice our children, but do we have anywhere near the level of faith of Abraham that did? Are we willing to step out of our comfort zone? Are we willing to do something that maybe forces us to make some kind of sacrifice? You know, Abraham here is willing to sacrifice his son. Are we willing to sacrifice our time? Are we willing to sacrifice our money? Are we willing to sacrifice our means? Do we have a level of faith to the extent that we know that if God wants us to do it, He'll get us there? Or are we in that mindset that we're going to help God push things along? And that maybe we'll help God's plan because we have an idea that makes it better. Where is the level of our faith compared to that of Abraham? I hear footsteps in the hallway, so we will stop there and we will pick up right here next week.